The radio crackled with static before Colonel Morrison's voice cut through the interference like broken glass. Rampart Base, this is Overwatch 6, confirming visual on target coordinates. The town is... Christ, the town is gone. His words hung in the operations center's stale air, each syllable carrying the weight of something no manual had prepared them for. Major Katia Raven Volkov sat forward in her chair, her calloused fingers tightening around her headset as she processed what she'd just heard. Gone didn't mean evacuated. Gone didn't mean damaged. In Morrison's 23 years of service, he'd never used that word lightly. The satellite feed flickered on the main display, revealing a perfect circle of ash where Millbrook had stood 6 hours earlier. Population 8,847, according to the census. Now it was a crater filled with something that moved wrong, like smoke that breathed, like shadows that had weight. The thermal imaging showed nothing. No heat signatures, no survivors, no explanation for why an American town had simply ceased to exist between breakfast and lunch on a Tuesday. "Sir, we have multiple aircraft requesting clearance for reconnaissance," Communications Specialist Torres announced, his usually steady voice cracking on the final word. F-16s, F-22s, even the Navy's asking if they can send a Hornet squadron from Norfolk. General Patricia Hayes stood behind the tactical display, her steel-gray hair reflecting the amber glow of warning lights that had been flashing for 6 consecutive hours. She'd seen combat in 3 theaters, had medals that proved her worth to anyone foolish enough to question it. But the satellite images made her feel like a cadet again, unprepared, overwhelmed, terrified of making the wrong call with American lives hanging in the balance. "Negative on all fast movers," Hayes finally spoke, her command voice carrying across the hushed operations center. "Whatever did this might still be active. We're not sending million-dollar aircraft into unknown airspace until we understand the threat parameters." That's when Raven Volkov cleared her throat. She'd been silent for most of the briefing, arms crossed, studying the displays with the calculated patience of someone who'd learned that speaking too soon in rooms full of men usually meant being ignored entirely. "Ma'am, I could take the Warthog in low and slow. If there's something in that airspace, the A-10's built to take punishment and keep flying. We could get visual confirmation without risking pilots or expensive platforms." The room fell silent. 12 years of service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 distinguished flying cross, and they still looked at her like she'd suggested flying there on fairy wings and wishful thinking. Raven Volkov had earned her call sign during her second deployment when she'd brought her damaged A-10 home on 1 engine, after a surface-to-air missile had torn through her starboard wing. The Taliban fighters who'd shot at her told stories afterward about the black bird that wouldn't die, how it had circled back through the smoke and delivered death with surgical precision before disappearing into the mountains like a phantom. But here, in this sterile room filled with career officers who'd never felt an aircraft shudder under enemy fire, she was still just the pilot who'd been passed over for promotion 3 times. General Hayes studied the satellite feed again, watching the unnatural movement in what used to be Millbrook's downtown district. Standard doctrine called for standoff weapons, surgical strikes from maximum range, overwhelming force applied with clinical precision. But standard doctrine hadn't prepared them for American soil turning to ash in the space of a morning coffee break. The A-10's, a ground attack platform, Major, not exactly built for reconnaissance missions. "With respect, ma'am, the Warthog's built to survive whatever hell throws at it and come home to tell the story." Raven stood slowly, her movements deliberate and measured. At 5'6", she wasn't an imposing figure, but something in her voice made the room's attention focus like a laser sight. "Those fast movers you're worried about, they're built for speed and altitude. Put them low and slow through whatever's happening in that crater, and you'll lose aircraft and pilots. The A-10 was designed to fly through surface-to-air missile fields and keep fighting. If there's something hostile in that airspace, I'll find it. If there's something that needs killing, I'll kill it." Colonel Morrison's voice crackled through the speakers again, his forward observation team reporting from the perimeter they'd established 5 miles from the crater's edge. Overwatch 6 to Rampart Base. We're seeing movement in the target area. Repeat, we have movement. Recommend immediate. The transmission cut to static. Lieutenant Colonel James "Brick" Patterson, Hayes's deputy commander, leaned forward over the tactical display. He'd flown F-15 Eagles for 15 years before transitioning to command roles, and the skepticism in his voice was barely concealed. Major Volkov, no disrespect, but you're talking about flying a $30 million aircraft into a complete unknown. We don't know if it's chemical, biological, nuclear, or something else entirely. Hell, we don't even know if normal physics apply in that airspace anymore. Raven met his gaze without flinching. She'd heard that tone before, that careful military politeness that really meant sit down and let the grown-ups talk. Sir, that's exactly why you send the A-10. It's not about the aircraft's value, it's about survivability. The Warthog's taken direct hits from 57mm anti-aircraft guns and kept flying. It's designed with redundant systems, armored cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks. If something goes wrong in that airspace, I've got a better chance of making it home to brief you on what I saw than any other platform in the inventory. The operations center hummed with nervous energy as technicians monitored feeds from satellites, ground sensors, and the increasingly frantic radio traffic from units establishing a perimeter around the affected area. Every few minutes, someone would request permission to move closer to the crater, and every time, Hayes denied the request. But they all knew that eventually, someone would have to go in and find answers. The thing that moved wrong in the satellite feed had started spreading beyond the original crater's boundaries, a slow expansion that defied conventional understanding of physics or biology. Whatever had taken Millbrook was growing, and it was growing toward populated areas. Time was running out for careful planning and risk assessment. Sometimes, Raven thought as she watched the general's face, military leadership meant accepting that there were no good options, only necessary ones. General Hayes walked to the secure phone mounted on the operations center's wall, the red handset that connected directly to the Pentagon. She spoke in quiet tones for several minutes while the room watched the satellite feed and tried not to think about what would happen if whatever had consumed Millbrook reached the suburbs of Richmond 50 miles to the southeast. When she returned to the tactical display, her expression had hardened into the mask of command decision. Major Volkov, you're authorized for reconnaissance mission Raven 1. Single aircraft, low-level penetration of the affected area, visual and electronic intelligence gathering, minimum engagement unless fired upon. Hayes paused, studying the younger officer's face. I'm not sending you on a suicide mission, Major. You get eyes on target, you report what you see, and you get the hell out of there. Understood. Raven nodded once, sharp and professional. Understood, ma'am. When do I launch? 30 minutes. And Major, Hayes's voice softened almost imperceptibly. Your aircraft call sign for this mission will be Raven 1. Seems appropriate. The briefing room emptied as personnel rushed to prepare for a mission unlike any in Air Force history. Raven walked toward the flight line with measured steps, her mind already shifting into the calm, analytical mode that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments. Behind her, she could hear Lieutenant Colonel Patterson muttering something about sending a woman to do reconnaissance work. But she didn't turn around. She'd learned long ago that proving herself meant action, not argument. The A-10 Thunderbolt II waited on the flight line like a patient predator, its gray-green camouflage scheme designed to blend with forests and farmland rather than the sterile environment of an Air Force base. Maintenance Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez had been working on the aircraft since before dawn, running diagnostic checks and loading systems that might be needed for an enemy no one understood. When he saw Raven approaching, he straightened to attention. Ma'am, she's ready to fly. Full fuel load, standard 30mm ammunition for the GAU-8, and we've loaded Maverick missiles on stations 3 and 9 just in case you need precision engagement capability. Rodriguez had been maintaining A-10s for 18 years, and he'd never sent one into a mission briefing that started with, "We don't know what you'll encounter, but it probably violates the laws of physics." Raven ran her hands along the aircraft's armored belly, feeling the reassuring solidity of titanium plating that could absorb punishment that would destroy lesser machines. The A-10 wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense. It was too angular, too focused on function over form. But to her, it represented something more valuable than aesthetics. It represented coming home alive when everything went wrong. "Chief, I need you to monitor radio traffic while I'm airborne. If communication cuts out completely, assume I've encountered some kind of electronic interference and start tracking my GPS beacon. If the beacon goes dark," she paused, considering the implications. "If the beacon goes dark, recommend that General Hayes authorize nuclear sterilization of the entire area. Whatever's in that crater, we can't let it spread to populated areas." Rodriguez nodded grimly. In 18 years of aircraft maintenance, he'd never had a pilot give him instructions for recommending nuclear strikes on American soil. "Understood, ma'am. Bring her home safe." Raven climbed into the cockpit with practiced efficiency, her hands moving through startup procedures she could perform blindfolded. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spun up with their characteristic whine, a sound that had become synonymous with close air support for ground forces around the world. But today, there would be no friendly forces to support, no enemy positions marked by smoke grenades. Today, she would fly alone into an airspace that had swallowed an entire town and left only questions in its wake. Rampart Tower, Raven 1 requesting clearance for takeoff. Raven 1, Rampart Tower. You are cleared for takeoff runway 27. Wind is light and variable. And Major. The tower controller's voice carried an unusual note of emotion. Good hunting. The A-10 lifted off into a sky that looked deceptively normal, blue and clear, with scattered cumulus clouds that belonged to a Tuesday afternoon when the biggest worry should have been afternoon thunderstorms. Raven banked southwest toward the coordinates where Millbrook used to exist, climbing to 5,000 feet for the initial approach. At this altitude, she could see the dark smudge on the horizon that marked the crater's location, a perfect circle of wrongness against the Virginia landscape. 20 minutes into the flight, her radio crackled with updates from ground reconnaissance teams positioned around the perimeter. The expansion had accelerated in the past hour, growing from a 2-mile diameter to nearly 4 miles. Whatever it was consuming everything in its path: trees, roads, buildings, Earth itself, and leaving behind that strange substance that moved like living shadow but registered no thermal signature. Raven 1, this is Overwatch 6. Colonel Morrison's voice came through with surprising clarity despite the interference that had been plaguing communications all morning. We've established visual contact with your aircraft. Be advised, we're seeing unusual atmospheric disturbance over the target area. Recommend extreme caution during approach. Raven acknowledged the transmission and began her descent toward the crater. At 3,000 feet, she could see the edge clearly, a perfect demarcation where normal Earth met something that hurt to look at directly. The satellite images hadn't captured the way it seemed to absorb light, creating an optical effect that made depth perception impossible. It was like looking into a hole in reality itself. At 2,000 feet, her instruments began behaving strangely. The GPS flickered between multiple positions, none of them accurate. The radar showed contacts that couldn't exist, solid returns from empty air, gaps where the ground should be reflecting signals. Her radio filled with static that almost sounded like voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. Rampart Base, Raven 1. Beginning low-level reconnaissance pass. Instruments are experiencing significant interference, but aircraft systems remain stable. Raven's voice stayed calm and professional even as every instinct screamed at her to turn around and flee. But running wasn't an option. not when American civilians were dying and military leadership needed answers that only close observation could provide. She dropped to 500 feet above ground level and began her first pass over what had once been Millbrook's main street. Through the cockpit glass, she could see into the crater itself, and what she saw there would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The town hadn't been destroyed. It had been transformed into something that violated basic understanding of matter and energy. Buildings existed in impossible configurations, their geometry folded through dimensions that human eyes couldn't properly process. Streets curved upward into empty air, connecting to structures that cast shadows in directions where no light source existed. And everywhere, moving through this architectural nightmare, were shapes that had once been people, but were now something else entirely. "Jesus Christ," Raven whispered, forgetting radio protocol as she banked for another pass. The shapes looked up at her aircraft with movements that were too coordinated, too purposeful. They were aware of her presence, and they were interested. Her radio exploded with static, then cleared suddenly as a voice that definitely wasn't Colonel Morrison came through her headset. "Welcome, Raven. We've been waiting for you to join us. The transformation is beautiful, isn't it? You can see what we've become, what you can become. Land your aircraft and walk among us. Feel the change." Raven's training kicked in, overriding the horror of what she was witnessing. She keyed her radio and transmitted on all frequencies. "Rampart Base, Raven 1. Target area is hostile and actively attempting communication. Recommend immediate establishment of no-fly zone extending to 20-mile radius. Whatever happened here is intelligent, organized, and extremely dangerous." The voice in her headset laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with children's laughter. "You can't run from us, Raven. We know who you are, what you've done, what you fear. We can give you everything you've ever wanted: respect, recognition, a place where your skills matter more than your gender or your politics. Just land the aircraft." Instead, Raven pulled back on the stick and climbed toward safer altitude, her mind racing through tactical options. The entity or entities in the crater weren't just randomly destructive. They were strategic, manipulative, capable of psychological warfare. They'd targeted her personally, using information they couldn't possibly possess through normal means. As she climbed through 1,500 feet, the shapes in the crater began moving with coordinated purpose. They formed patterns that resembled anti-aircraft gun emplacements, their movements synchronized like a military drill performed by creatures that had never been human. Raven realized with growing dread that they were learning, adapting, preparing for future encounters with aircraft. "Raven 1, this is Rampart Base. We're losing your telemetry signal. Confirm your status and intentions." "Rampart Base, Raven 1 is climbing to safe altitude for tactical assessment. The target area is actively hostile and demonstrating organized military-style coordination. Recommend immediate evacuation of all civilian populations within 50-mile radius and preparation for potential military engagement with unknown enemy force." Raven leveled off at 10,000 feet, well above any conventional anti-aircraft threat. But she had no idea what conventional meant when dealing with entities that had consumed an entire town and transformed it into something from humanity's worst nightmares. She began a wide orbit around the crater, using her aircraft's sensors to map the extent of the contaminated area and document whatever intelligence she could gather. The expansion had accelerated again while she'd been conducting close observation. The crater now stretched nearly 6 miles in diameter, and the leading edge was approaching Interstate 64, a major transportation corridor that connected Richmond to Norfolk. If the entity reached that highway, it would have access to thousands of vehicles and their occupants, potential fuel for whatever transformation process had consumed Millbrook. "Rampart Base, Raven 1. The target area has expanded significantly during my observation period. Current diameter approximately 6 miles and growing. Recommend immediate closure of Interstate 64 and establishment of military perimeter at minimum 20-mile radius. Raven paused, choosing her next words carefully. Also recommend notification of National Command Authority. This situation is beyond the scope of conventional military response. General Hayes's voice came through the radio with unusual clarity. Raven 1, understood on all recommendations. What's your assessment of the threat's nature and capabilities? Raven considered her response while maintaining her orbit above the crater. Below, she could see the transformed shapes of former Millbrook residents arranging themselves in increasingly complex patterns, as if they were preparing for some kind of ceremony or military operation. Ma'am, the threat appears to be intelligent, organized, and capable of rapid adaptation. It's actively attempting psychological manipulation of military personnel and demonstrating tactical awareness of military aviation capabilities. I recommend treating this as an invasion scenario rather than a natural disaster or industrial accident. The silence that followed her transmission stretched long enough for Raven to complete another full orbit of the crater. When Hayes finally responded, her voice carried the weight of command decisions that would define careers and potentially determine the survival of American civilization. Raven 1 returned to base for debrief. We're implementing your recommendations and preparing for expanded operations. Well done, Major. As Raven turned her A-10 toward home, she took one last look at the crater that had been Millbrook. The shapes were still moving down there, still arranging themselves in patterns that suggested intelligence far beyond what any human military strategist could comprehend. She'd gotten the answers General Hayes needed, but those answers raised questions that made her wish she'd never volunteered for this mission. The flight back to Rampart Air Force Base took 20 minutes, but it felt like hours as Raven processed what she'd witnessed. The radio chatter from ground units establishing the expanded perimeter painted a picture of controlled panic as military personnel struggled to comprehend orders that sounded like science fiction. Evacuate 50 miles of Virginia countryside. Prepare for engagement with hostile entities of unknown origin and capability. Request nuclear authorization from National Command Authority. During her approach to Rampart's runway, Raven could see the base transforming around her. Additional aircraft were arriving hourly. F-16 Fighting Falcons from Shaw Air Force Base, F-22 Raptors from Langley, even a squadron of Marine Corps AV-8B Harriers that had been diverted from exercises off the North Carolina coast. The parking ramps that had been half empty that morning were now crowded with combat aircraft and the support equipment needed for sustained military operations. She touched down on runway 27 with the smooth precision of someone who'd made thousands of similar landings, but her hands were trembling as she taxied toward the maintenance hangar. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez was waiting with his team, their faces grim with the knowledge that their pilot had just returned from a reconnaissance mission that had changed the fundamental nature of military conflict. "How'd she handle, ma'am?" Rodriguez asked as Raven climbed down from the cockpit. "Like a dream, Chief, but we're going to need her ready for combat operations within the hour. Load maximum ordnance configuration, Mavericks, cluster bombs, whatever you've got that's designed for area denial." Raven stripped off her helmet and ran fingers through sweat-dampened hair. "And Chief, if I don't make it back from the next mission, tell General Hayes that nuclear sterilization might be our only option. What's in that crater isn't just dangerous, it's spreading and it's learning." The debrief lasted 3 hours, with Raven describing everything she'd observed to a room full of general officers, intelligence analysts, and civilian experts who'd been hastily flown in from various government agencies. They asked detailed questions about the entity's apparent intelligence, its ability to communicate, its tactical organization, and its expansion rate. Most disturbing was her report of its psychological manipulation attempts and its specific knowledge of her personal information. "Major, you mentioned that the entity addressed you by name and made specific references to your military career. How could it possibly have access to that information? Dr. Sarah Chen, a behavioral psychologist from the Defense Intelligence Agency, leaned forward across the briefing table. Raven met her gaze directly. "Ma'am, I have no idea, but it knew things that aren't in my official records. Personal details about my motivations for joining the Air Force, specific incidents from my deployments that were classified. It's either capable of reading minds, or it has access to information sources that go beyond anything in our understanding of intelligence gathering." General Hayes stood at the front of the briefing room, studying reconnaissance photos that had been taken during Raven's overflight. The images showed the crater's impossible geometry in stark detail, architectural configurations that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human eyes could process. Ladies and gentlemen, we're facing something unprecedented in military history. An entity that can transform American territory and American citizens into something hostile, organized, and apparently invulnerable to conventional reconnaissance. Colonel Patterson raised his hand. "Ma'am, shouldn't we consider the possibility that Major Volkov misinterpreted what she observed? Stress, unusual atmospheric conditions, equipment malfunction. There are several explanations for hallucinations or misperceptions." The room fell silent. Raven felt the familiar burn of professional skepticism aimed at her credibility, the assumption that a female pilot might not be reliable under extreme stress. She'd faced it before, but never when American lives hung in the balance. "Sir, my aircraft's recording systems captured everything I observed. The gun camera footage, radar tracks, radio transmissions, it's all documented." Raven's voice stayed level, professional. "And sir, if you think I'm hallucinating, I respectfully suggest you take the next reconnaissance flight yourself." General Hayes intervened before the exchange could escalate. "That's enough. Major Volkov's report is consistent with ground observations and satellite intelligence. We're proceeding on the assumption that her reconnaissance is accurate." She turned to address the room. "The President has authorized military action to contain this threat. Operation Raven Shield begins at 600 tomorrow morning, with precision airstrikes designed to halt the entity's expansion." The briefing broke up with personnel scattering to prepare for combat operations against an enemy that defied every doctrine in military history. Raven walked toward the flight line, knowing that tomorrow would bring her face to face with the entity again. But this time she wouldn't be alone. The question that haunted her was whether conventional military force would have any effect on something that had already demonstrated the ability to transform reality itself. As she passed the base chapel, Raven made a decision that surprised her. She hadn't been inside a church since her father's funeral 8 years earlier, but something about facing an enemy that might not follow the laws of physics made her want to hedge her bets with higher powers. The chapel was empty except for Chaplain Mitchell, an elderly Air Force colonel who'd been counseling military personnel through spiritual crises for 3 decades. "Major Volkov, isn't it? I heard about your reconnaissance mission today." Chaplain Mitchell looked up from the paperwork spread across his desk. "How are you holding up?" Raven sat down in the front pew, still wearing her flight suit and carrying her helmet bag. "Honestly, Chaplain, I've seen combat in Afghanistan, been shot at by Taliban fighters, watched friends die in helicopter crashes. But what I saw today, it's different. It's like someone took everything I thought I understood about reality and threw it in a blender. Fear of the unknown is natural, Major. What matters is how we respond to that fear." The chaplain closed his paperwork and gave her his full attention. "Are you afraid of dying tomorrow?" "No, sir. I'm afraid of what happens if we fail to stop this thing from spreading. I'm afraid that conventional military thinking isn't adequate for this threat. And I'm afraid that my superiors are going to send good people to die because they can't, except that the rules of engagement have fundamentally changed." Chaplain Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes, Major, military leadership means accepting that there are situations where traditional doctrine doesn't apply. The question is whether we're wise enough to adapt our thinking or stubborn enough to repeat historical mistakes. That night, Raven lay in her quarters reviewing tactical manuals and weapon specifications, preparing for a combat mission against an enemy that might be invulnerable to kinetic weapons. Outside her window, she could see aircraft arriving throughout the night, bombers from Barksdale Air Force Base, attack helicopters from Fort Campbell, even Navy ships positioning themselves off the Virginia coast. The full weight of American military power was mobilizing to face the entity that had consumed Millbrook. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, Raven couldn't shake the memory of those transformed shapes arranging themselves in tactical formations, learning and adapting with each passing hour. Tomorrow's battle would determine whether human military technology could overcome an enemy that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of physics and warfare. And if they failed, the entity would continue expanding until it reached populated areas where millions of American civilians had no idea that their government was fighting for their very existence. The alarm went off at 4:30, giving Raven 2 hours to prepare for a mission that would either halt the entity's expansion or prove that conventional military force was useless against this new category of threat. As she dressed in her flight gear and reviewed the mission briefing one final time, she thought about her call sign and how appropriate it had become. Ravens were carrion birds, creatures that fed on the aftermath of violence and death. Tomorrow, she would discover whether she was flying toward victory or toward the beginning of humanity's darkest chapter. Operation Raven Shield commenced at dawn with a coordinated strike from 12 F-16 Fighting Falcons, each carrying maximum ordnance loads designed to create overlapping fields of destruction across the entity's perimeter. Raven watched from 10,000 feet as precision-guided munitions impacted the crater's edge, creating massive explosions that should have obliterated any conventional target. Instead, the entity absorbed the kinetic energy and continued its expansion, now reaching toward residential areas that had been partially evacuated during the night. Rampart Base, Raven 1. Precision strikes appear to have no effect on target. Repeat, no effect. Raven's voice carried across radio frequencies monitored by commanders throughout the eastern United States. Recommend immediate implementation of contingency plans. The contingency plans involved nuclear weapons, strategic bombers, and the possibility that a significant portion of Virginia might become uninhabitable for decades. As Raven banked her A-10 for another observation pass, she realized that her reconnaissance mission had been the beginning of something far larger than anyone had anticipated. The entity wasn't just a threat to Millbrook or even to Virginia. It represented a fundamental challenge to human civilization's ability to defend itself against forces that operated outside known physical laws. But that was a problem for generals and politicians. Raven's job was simpler: fly into hell, observe the enemy, and bring back intelligence that might save lives. As she descended toward the expanding crater for what might be humanity's last close look at the entity, she keyed her radio one final time. Rampart Base, Raven 1 beginning final reconnaissance pass. If this transmission cuts out, implement nuclear protocols immediately. Some prices are too high to pay, even for victory. Below her, the entity waited with the patience of something that had already won the game before human players realized they were playing. And in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II, Major Katia, Raven, Volkov flew toward answers that would either save her country or confirm that the age of human dominance on Earth was ending with the sunrise over a transformed Virginia landscape. The entity's voice filled her headset one last time as she approached the crater's edge. "Welcome home, Raven. We've been preparing a place for you among us. Your transformation will be glorious." Raven's response was delivered through the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 30 millimeters of depleted uranium ammunition fired at maximum rate into the heart of the entity's strongest concentration. The rounds disappeared into the writhing mass without effect, swallowed by something that treated kinetic energy as merely another form of nourishment. But the gesture felt important, a final statement that humanity would not surrender without a fight, even against forces beyond comprehension. As she climbed away from the crater for the last time, Raven Volkov carried with her the knowledge that would reshape military doctrine and human understanding of their place in the universe. Behind her, the entity continued its patient expansion toward population centers, secure in the knowledge that conventional weapons could not halt its progress. The only question remaining was whether human civilization possessed the wisdom and courage to choose the unthinkable option that might be their only path to survival. In 6 hours, that decision would determine the fate of millions, and Major Raven Volkov would be the pilot chosen to deliver humanity's final answer to an enemy that had already rewritten the rules of warfare itself.